From one early access story to another, we venture this time instead to the far more palatable tale of Devespresso Games' The Coma 2 Viscious Sisters. Sequel to 2015's The Coma Cutting Class, which was itself remastered into The Coma Recut in late 2017, Viscious Sisters continues the story of the titular Coma, a nightmarish realm brimming with monstrosities and the attempts of a mysterious group known as the Ghost Vigilantes to curtail the calamity within. Viscious Sisters is, in every single conceivable way, a vastly superior game to the Coma. So let's quickly dive into Recut before we talk about how Viscious Sisters is an excellent example of how to use early access and fan feedback to improve the experience. The Coma Recut was a game I missed out on when it was originally released back in 2015, although I heard of it sometime later when the remaster was announced, and kept it on my radar for a while before finally caving and picking it up. I'd heard it was good but frustrating, and damn if that is not the truth. The Coma tells the story of Young-ho, a Korean high school student about to sit a series of important exams who arrives at school one morning to see an ambulance carrying away a student, one who apparently attempted to commit suicide. He also sees a strange young woman in another school's uniform who blanks Young-ho when he tries to speak to her. He also happens across a locket on the ground and mindlessly takes it with him as he heads into school, but as he sits at his desk to take his first exam, his eyes grow heavy and he finds himself falling into what seems to be innocent slumber. Young-ho soon awakens in the bleak, nightmarish world of the Coma with one simple goal: get the hell out. The Korean education system is well known to be merciless, with expectations for its students obscenely high from parents and academia alike. Just under 70% of the country has achieved a post-secondary education qualification, university for example, and society disfavours those who issue higher education. Indeed, the notorious CSATs, known in Korea as Suneung, are university entrance exams that carry with them a reputation for being punishingly difficult. And the country's brutal education system is often pointed at as a source for the relatively high suicide rates among young people. Devespresso Games have been fairly transparent about the fact that although the Coma can be viewed with outside eyes as a simple horror game, it is greatly influenced by the Korean education system, and seeks to portray just how horrifying it can truly be. That said, whilst the story and characters of Recut are fascinating, it does suffer from a few problems. As you journey around the world of the Coma, which in Recut is entirely confined to a sort of otherworld version of Seiwa High School, you're encouraged to make expedient use of your map, which updates with each new area that you enter, and it's up to you to remember the best or only routes to and from places. Particularly in a late game, many of the staircases and corridors are blocked to some degree, forcing you to make dangerous detours around the other classrooms. These are not marked on your map, so like Resident Evil before it, the idea is that you have the map for quick reference, but you should also be memorising its layout and keeping mental track of where you are and where you need to go. It's certainly quite difficult at times, but it does feed into that feeling of oppressive, daunting horror as you make your way through dizzying and maze-like corridors. The game's excellent art style makes it easy to fall into the world, with its twisted denizens being the warped souls of other students trapped within the Coma or dark reflections of those tormented by something, often with a side quest attached. These side quests are generally quite simple requests, but the way they feed into the ending you achieve, of which in the first game there are 5, really isn't. Even so, the game looks and plays great, being a 2D side-scroller where your primary abilities are exploration, hiding and sprinting the hell away from your main nemesis. As you explore, you will periodically be made to escape from an entity known as Dark Song, a comified version of Young-ho's English teacher. She will chase you at irregular intervals throughout the game, becoming more and more beastly and vicious as you proceed. Her design is excellent and she can be quite daunting to begin with. And the game's encouragement to learn the map factors in here as well, for the only way to escape Song is to find a place to hide, something that isn't always easily available. You can loop around areas, duck in and out of rooms, but not everything is open from the off, and not every room has a cupboard or a table to hide in or under. Alternatively, you can also hurriedly duck into a room and use the hold your breath mechanic, which, if you have enough stamina, can last you long enough that Song will be unable to find you in the darkness. Although an excellent premise and a fairly simple, easy to jump into game, it does have those niggling issues that I mentioned earlier. For example, many of the game's other enemies, such as dangling bodies that try to fall on your head, crawling enemies that swipe at you as you walk past, and poisonous plants that explode if you get too close, are rendered almost entirely useless due to the fact that they often trigger when you first enter an area regardless of how close you are to them. You can exploit this by simply standing still for a few seconds until you hear the associated noise of something thudding to the ground or exploding, meaning that the only thing that really presents any threat is Song herself. And that said, outrunning her is usually quite simple, but if she gets too close there is a dodge mechanic, which I personally could never get to work reliably. Many times I would be sure I dodged through something only to be struck regardless, and it's often easier to just run up a nearby set of stairs or enter a door, since you do have invincibility frames in the middle of transition animations, meaning that even if Song spawns right next to you, she can't hit you as long as you interact with the door or staircase before she starts her attack animation. And believe me, she will spawn next to you. A lot. A frustrating amount of times I would leave a room after a long period of time spent without interruption only to have her pop up right beside me. Or I would walk down a staircase and she'd be right there in my face, forcing me to backtrack again. This isn't terrible in theory, but it does unnaturally elongate the game when she appears out of thin air and wastes 30 seconds whilst you run to the nearest hiding spot, hide, and then run back again the instant she's gone. There are also no-go zones in the game where Song simply won't enter, so if you're near one of those, her presence is basically just a minor annoyance, like a particularly determined fly. With how vague the game can be about what you should be doing at times, this amplifies the frustration at Song's antics, and it is the primary reason why I would recommend watching a video playthrough of the game rather than actually buying it yourself, unless you have vast fonts of patience. The game has that occasionally irritating mechanic of not letting you interact with something until you've triggered the appropriate piece of dialogue or picked up a specific note, but with how vague some of these notes can be, you might very well find yourself running around in squares, intermittently interrupted by a big-titted woman with a knife, for an inordinate amount of time. It's good once you look past its issues, don't get me wrong, but the Coma 2 is much better. What struck me straight from the off about Viscious Sisters was how much more visceral the art style is. Everything that was slightly grotesque or off-putting about the original game has been amplified tenfold. Sisters drips with menace and hideous, twisted nightmares that writhe and crawl as you wander. Corpses line the corridors and the streets, many of them contorted into horrific death poses, or trapped between walls, between floors, often limbless or amalgamated into a heaving mass of warped bodies. With the expansion of the game's story and universe also comes a much broader scale. You're no longer confined to Seiwa High School, but rather are able to explore the surrounding areas, from the local police station to the train station, a nearby market and more. Every possible opportunity to revel in the fantastic style has been taken to the maximum possible effect, and with the far tighter combat mechanics, there's also a lot more room to breathe, giving you ample opportunity to actually enjoy the glorious visuals. Before I dive too deeply into gushing about the developer's ability to take the flawed but good aspects of the Coma and make them great, let's go through the story relatively spoiler-free. After the end of the first game, Young-ho suffers a seizure during his exam and, predictably, falls into a coma. His best friend Mina, who is briefly seen in the original game, is the protagonist of Viscious Sisters, after stumbling across a ritual site of sorts and being transported to the nightmare world of the Coma as a result. Although it does transpire to be a little more complicated than that. Once there, she comes across Seiho, another returning character and classmate, who appears to be offering assistance, along with an expanded cast of characters whom she soon knows as the Ghost Vigilantes. Mina's goal is initially simple, like the first game, she just needs to escape. But as more of the Coma opens up to her and the Vigilantes also begin to confide in her, it becomes far more than just a battle for survival. Whilst the game is a direct sequel, it can be played with little to no knowledge of its predecessor, as it does a fairly bang-up job of explaining the circumstances of the original game, but really much of what makes Viscious Sisters excellent is less to do with it continuing the original story and more to do with just how much more intrigue and mystery it brings to its own cast of characters and its themes. As with the first game, Sisters is deeply explorative of topics of Korean education and its detrimental effects on students, as well as matters of faith, family, and friendship, with many of the side stories exploring tough ideas in a sensitive but frank manner. With the way the game opens, and particularly its characterisation of many of the students, you could be forgiven for thinking that it might just be skin deep, but by the conclusion, it weaves together a difficult and timeless tale that tears apart the image of Korea's educational perfection. From an outside perspective at least, it is superb. In addition to the huge visual upgrade, the character models have also been entirely redesigned, and in particular the emphasis on mutation and the eldritch horrors that have overtaken much of the city is excellent to view. Of particular note is the way that Myung-gil, one of Mina's fellow students and a hot-headed prick to boot, did appear as a deformed shade in the original game, but his overhauled design in Viscious Sisters is absolutely superior. His jaw is impossibly wide, far too many teeth brimming and spilling from his mouth, grotesquely misshapen in a way that emphasises his personality. Big-mouthed, speaking and acting before thinking, his eyes lost in the tangled mess of his skull. It's visceral, creepy, and fantastic. Similarly, other characters you'll come across have been malformed in their own ways, each with their own story to tell, and coupled with the sheer visual gratuity of the environments, it makes for a stunning upgrade to the already fascinating world of the original Coma. Beyond its graphical improvements, every mechanic has been tightened to perfection as well. The dodge function now actually works reliably, making your escapes from Darksong and other creatures a true matter of timing instead of guesswork. Environmental hazards must now be carefully traversed or baited into triggering, as you can no longer just sit and wait until they disappear of their own accord. Furthermore, the randomness to the main enemy's pattern has greatly improved, and whilst it's still possible for Song or similar enemies to spawn just as you enter a corridor or leave a room, you can now actively track her movements by listening for her footsteps. The louder they are, the closer she is, and you can hear her wandering around even if you're in another room or on another floor. Due to this, exploring becomes a far more interesting game of cat and mouse, with you ducking and weaving in and out of rooms. Making careful use of your torch, which when switched off is now far more likely to assist in concealing you, whereas the original was rather spotty on this matter, and ducking into the various hiding spots you have at your disposal. If you do get grabbed, you also have access to a new quick slot item, in the same vein as the original Resident Evil remake, which can be used to force Song to release a stranglehold. Once used, it is removed from your inventory and another must be found. If you're grabbed when you don't have any mace, it's instant death. Better still, there is now a greater variety to your enemies, as each new area features an increasing roster of violent monstrosities just itching to sink their teeth in. Once again, you are encouraged to use your map to the fullest and to memorise the best routes around various areas. However, this also involves memorising various early game areas, which are inaccessible to begin with, as progression brings with it new tools and tricks such as a crowbar or these charming little paranormal matches. Whilst it's not always necessary to backtrack, doing so can net you some pretty decent upgrades, which makes survival all the easier. It's also nowhere near as tedious as exploring was in the previous game, as your map now actively updates with points of interest, shortcuts, blockages, and so on. Due to this, you'll be able to easily keep track of the location of white burrows, which are massive tunnels that can transport you not just between rooms in the same zone, but between different buildings entirely, allowing you to quickly and efficiently move from area to area without hassle, in case you do want to go back and explore older areas. Although backtracking is necessary in certain parts of the game, it never feels excessive, and returning to previous areas doesn't despawn enemies, so you'll still need to be fairly careful. The way the game loops around on itself, providing ample opportunity to move to and from areas without much hassle, is such a huge improvement over the stress of navigating the original game, particularly when it's on such a larger scale, that I simply have to give the developers props for their efforts to acknowledge and resolve the flaws of their maiden voyage. Even so, there is one little niggling matter that I should address, which is the inclusion of a large number of Quicktime Events. When you enter a hiding spot while being chased, you will need to complete between 2 to 4 QTEs to ensure you're not found, which will vary in number and difficulty based on how quickly the enemy leaves the area and how much stamina you had left when you entered the hiding spot. There are also QTEs you'll need to complete when transitioning between certain areas or completing the crafting side quest that appears in many of the game's areas. Failing is almost always an instant game over regardless of how much health you have left, but there's generally an ample amount of time to complete them, to the point where, whilst I found them slightly intrusive, they never felt too punishing. I would imagine that the idea was to include a little more interactivity rather than just having you sitting still and waiting for the enemy to piss off, particularly given that stamina management plays a role in the QTEs associated with hiding. But I feel it would benefit from having the option to remove certain QTE requirements anyway. Not everything should be stripped away, since though cumbersome they're not exactly too stressful, but the sudden transition from a game with 0 QTEs into one that's absolutely loaded with them is a touch jarring, if nothing else. Despite that, so many leaps and bounds were made between this game and the last that it's legitimately impressive that everything pulls together so well. Throughout the duration of this game, I found myself in awe at how utterly different my reactions were to it, considering the topic of my last video and just how much I ragged on crowdfunding and early access being used to abuse the goodwill of the game in public. It's always a relief to come across a game whose early access period and previous difficulties have learned from the mistakes of its predecessor. It's also a breath of fresh air to enjoy an indie horror game that doesn't rely on shrieking violins and constant jump scares or just pure gore. Horror games with flair and style are becoming more and more common recently, what with fascinating, albeit oftentimes also very perplexing, creators like Chiller's Art and the huge variety of ridiculously low cost and ridiculously high quality one-man projects that decorate Itch.io's storefront. Even so, after the weird and wonderful world of Albino Lullaby cresting the peaks of sheer disappointment, the Coma 2 is one of the finest examples I've played in a long time of a simple concept executed near perfectly. And I swear, my excitement for this game has nothing to do with my obsession with K-pop. Honest. Well, shit.